Hello, in this video I'm going to cover another section of the verbal reasoning part of the GRE. This time it took me about just over 25 minutes to complete. You get 35 minutes, so that's more than enough time. Again, there are some pretty problematic questions in these practice tests, which aren't always reflective of the real test, but worthy of note to be prepared for some problematic wording and also content. This first one, Roger Williams was a dissenter from an early age, having rebelled against his own father as a young boy to follow the path of Puritans. He studied at Cambridge and then became a cleric, but was most notable even as a young chaplain for his strong beliefs in freedom of worship. After a year or two of butting his head against the strict high church administration, Williams took wife Mary and departed for Boston, arriving in 1631. Even in this new world, his radical ideas about the separation of church and state and the seizure of native land almost led to his deportation. In 1636, he established his own colony, Providence Plantation, with a few like-minded followers. We see the boxes. We have to choose more more than one if they apply, choose all that apply. The passage indicates that Roger Williams ran into resistance in Boston due to which of the following? His views about the separation of church and state. Yep, looking at this sentence here, even in the New World, his radical ideas about separation of church and state, and the second thing, seizure of native lands, also almost led to his deportation. So our answers then are A, his views about separation of church and state, and then his opposition to the takeover of land belonging to tribes, correct also. His adamant and radical belief about freedom of worship, not in the New World. He had a strong belief as a young chaplain, but that didn't cause him too much trouble. That's probably what made him leave England, or one of the reasons. Which of the following best summarizes the main idea of the passage? After failing as a cleric in England and then Boston, Roger Williams left the church and struck out on his own with a small band of followers. I like that, but the word cleric can be interpreted from an institutional perspective and maybe also from a spiritualist perspective. It's not really a title, whereas chaplain is a title, or priest perhaps is a title. So did he fail as a cleric? That's maybe a fallacy of wording, but let's look at the other answers. Roger Williams left England with a small band of followers. No, he left only with his wife, so that one's wrong. Roger Williams' resistance to authority and the status quo caused him to challenge everything from his own father to leaders in the New World. Yeah, I like that, but what I don't like is that as a main idea, it's all about his challenging, and then it brings up his father. I mean, I guess that's crucial. That's cultural also. In many cultures that's fairly normal. Of course, in 1630s England, not normal. And it is in the topic sentence, rebelled against his own father to follow the path of the Puritans. And then later, radical ideas, did he challenge the New World? Well, it's implied. Almost led to his deportation. And so we'll go with C. That's our first choice so far. The Puritan path is no longer for Roger Williams, and he set off for Boston to establish his own church. No, he wanted to follow the Puritan path. That was clear. He was a young boy to follow the Puritans, and then he butted heads with the church, and that's why he left. Sensing that he was never going to succeed in the high church, Roger would depart for Boston, where he seized native land. No, that's patently wrong. So C, although that's with an asterisk, I like A also because of the main ideas, but there's a problem with the word failing as a cleric. Did he fail? Well, he almost got deported. He had to leave England. That's a bit of a failure, but anyway. Underline the sentence that indicates he had his strong beliefs caused him trouble in England. Well, that one's fairly simple. Or is it after a year or two of butting heads? The high church, he left. So he had trouble in England, and then he left. He had a little bit more trouble, then he left again. Next. Puget Sound is typically considered a bay. In fact, it's a large saltwater estuary fed by fresh water from the Cascade Range and Olympic Mountain watersheds. The sound itself was carved out by glaciers, leaving a complex series of interconnected valleys and ridges called basins and sills. The sound has an average depth of about 450 feet, but north of the city of Seattle, the basin plunges to 930 feet. Water is always circulating within the sound at certain sills. Seaward moving surface water is sucked down to mix with incoming salt water. The result is a complicated tide pattern made even more complex by the many islands and narrow straits that crisscross the sound. The positive result of all this churning is a deposit of fairly rich and fertile soil along the mudflats and river valleys that border the sound. Which of these can be inferred? The sound is constantly changing blend of salt and seawater. That looks correct. The sound is salt water along the surface and fresh water below. I don't think so. It said the salt water is below. The seaward moving surface water is sucked down to mix with the incoming salt water. Sucked down, and then it would mix at the bottom with the salt water, which is heavier. The salt of the seawater is leached out by the time it reaches the shore. Leached out by what? That doesn't really imply that. It says that there are fertile river valleys and mudflats that border the sound. Of course, if they're fertile, they don't have a lot of salt, but not by the time it reaches the shore. Constant tides in Puget Sound leave the salt in basins and fresh water along the sills. No, it is mixing in the first sentence here, typically considered a bay, but in fact it's a large seawater estuary fed by fresh water. So there's fresh water coming in, there's seawater coming in, it's complex, it's always moving around, circulating. White water is always circulating within the sound, and so A so far is our best. Seaward moving water in the sound is saltier. Well, that doesn't really make sense either. It seems like the water coming in from the sea would be saltier. And in fact, it said in this sentence that seaward moving surface water is sucked down to mix with incoming salt water, so no. Choose the best. In 2017, central Mexico earthquake happened to occur on the anniversary of the earthquake in 1985 that killed thousands, and had just that day been blank with a national disaster drill rehearsed. No, calamitous would be the wrong type of word. Commemorated. Bequeathed? No. Bequeath is to a dead person or to give something to the next generation. Deracinated? No. Commemorated. That's the best one. Right? So on the very day of the 2017 earthquake, they had commemorated the 1985 earthquake with a special holiday. Number 6. The blank effect of elevator music cannot be underestimated. Several workers in the new office building reported being lulled into missing their floors entirely. Anodyne, Dolores. Ambient. I like ambient. Hermetic. No. I mean, when you think of an elevator, maybe hermetic comes to mind. Ambient, indoor. I guess, well, this is my skewed perception of music. Anodyne, meaning medicinal, soothing, is the answer. Ephemeral, meaning temporary, also makes sense because it's in an elevator music, it's in an elevator. Being lulled, I suppose, means being comforted or being somehow soothed so much that it's almost putting them to sleep. Anodyne, to me, refers more to medicine, but it means soothing in a way. Dolorous is incorrect. Ambient I like because, again, music and ambient go together. We've seen ambient genre of music. But given the second part of the sentence, being lulled and missing their floors entirely, I suppose anodyne is the best. Number 7, following World War II, the Dutch manufacturer Fokker developed the blank for small aircraft to use exclusively for the instruction of pilots. Facsimile is a copy. Embodiment can develop an embodiment. Signifier, again, it has to be a thing. A signifier is not a tangible thing. Prototype of an aircraft, those words go together. Can't develop a juncture for a small aircraft. These are all abstract concepts. Prototype. Raised by a father who was a noted experimental educator, the four Alcott girls received a blank education in the arts and sciences from such blank as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and Henry David Thoreau, all friends of the family and important thinkers blank. Well, you have to know who these people are. The first and last are important philosophers in the 1800s America. They were broad thinkers, definitely. I don't know who Margaret Fuller is, but I know the first and last, and they were philosophers in the American Enlightenment period, some scientific and more liberal arts, literary arts education. They were definitely luminaries, very famous names. And if you don't know these names, then geez, this is a tough question. And like if you're coming from somewhere else in the world, anyway. Past and present, that's correct. They were thinkers. They were important thinkers then, and they are important thinkers now, but in their own right is a little better because they are not currently thinking. They are dead. So again, you have to know who these people are to get past number 3. BDH. Next, the fortuitous 1964 meeting of guitarist Lou Reed and keyboardist and composerist John Cale would result in one of the most influential rock and roll collaborations of all time. The Velvet Underground, named after a book about aberrant sexual practices, never succeeded by today's standards, but the recordings they made influenced everyone from Patti Smith to U2. Cale and Reed joined with guitarist Sterling Morrison and drummer Maureen Tucker, and they played regular gigs in Greenwich Village before being spotted by artist Andy Warhol, who took them under his wing, became their manager-producer, and offered them German songstress Nico as a temporary teammate. Warhol's assistance and stunning album cover art helped the Velvet Underground break out of the New York scene. They toured with Andy Warhol's multimedia show throughout the U.S. and Canada in 1967. Cale and Reed fell out over artistic differences shortly thereafter. They simply could not agree upon an appropriate direction for the band. Although the Velvet Underground faded from view in the early 1970s, Lou Reed embarked on a solo career in the United States, and Cale, a Welshman by birth, did the same back in the UK. They came together again briefly in 1996 when their remarkable band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Choose each which applies. In which ways did Andy Warhol assist the Velvet Underground? He loaned them the use of a female singer. This is beyond problematic. I don't even want to address this as a possible answer. This suggests that the Nico was Andy's property for the loaning. I don't even want to talk about that. It's ridiculous. And even the wording up here, what did Andy do? They offered, this is problematic to say the least. They could have worded it differently, in which case it would have been true, like he introduced them to Nico and arranged their cooperation, in which case we would choose A, but he loaned them the use of a female singer. It was like he loaned them a guitar stand. Alright, so I'm not going to choose that one. He included them in films aired in his multimedia show. Well, we don't say anything about films. Multimedia show, yes, but we don't know if there were films. He provided artwork for their early record albums, that's correct. Choose the answer. In the first sentence of the passage, what does the author mean by fortuitous? Fortuitous means unexpected, right? Unplanned. Next, according to the author, which is true about the Velvet Underground, they were pedestrian but beloved. I don't think pedestrian is the right word. They were complex. I don't think anything in the paragraph suggests they were not gifted. They were gifted but enigmatic. These two words kind of go together, gifted and enigmatic. So the but, I don't know where that comes from. Avant-garde but transitory. Avant-garde kind of means transitory in a way. It's like cutting edge, new. It's bringing us into something, some new age. So I don't think those are necessarily comparison, contrast to one another. They were unprofitable but influential. That works. They were obscure but highly regarded. Also works. So they were obscure that they never succeeded by today's standards. Right? But they were very influential. They never succeeded by today's standards. Well, so that's the question. Is today's standards of success just about the money they made, or is it maybe also about how well known they were? I dare say that in the era of the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and other huge name bands, the Velvet Underground was relatively unknown, except in certain art circles. Though Lou Reed became very well known later, so let's just accept that profit is the mark, the measure of success, and go with that. Why does the author include information about the derivation of the band's name to explain the evolution of their unusual sound? No, he said it was in reference to a book about aberrant sexual practices, to reject popular notions about the band's origin. Doesn't say anything about popular notions, so we don't know. To hint at the band's attraction to a deviant lifestyle, well, again, kind of problematic in a free society in today's day and age. Yeah, this is a 2020 book, so I'm kind of surprised to see it there. But aberrant and deviant are kind of similar, I guess, in the context of 1967 or something. To reveal the band's appeal to all five senses? No. To highlight the hippie uniform? Well, uniform? No. In fact, I'd say they probably didn't wear a uniform. Next, jumping spiders or salticids are easily discerned from other types of spiders. As their name suggests, they use different forms of predation than do ordinary web-spinning spiders. Not content to sit and wait patiently for prey to cross their woven doorstep, salticids instead track their prey mercilessly and spring upon it, injecting them with a venom, consuming them on the spot, or using a strand of silk to drag it back to their lair to eat. This sort of behavior requires unusually superior eyesight, and the salticid's eyes, 8 of them, are both large and complex, with long tubular eyes that provide excellent resolution, combined with lateral eyes that have broad field of vision. If you watch a salticid hunt, you will see it spot spray with its lateral eyes, and then turn to focus in with its tubular front eyes. Underline the sentence that shows step by step. That's the one where they track it. This one here, not content. They track it, spring upon it, inject it, and consume it on the spot, or use a strand to drag it back to the lair. Best entry again. The Kavango people of Namibia are mainly Christian, although the religious activities often blank elements of traditional tribal rites. Incorporate. Replicate. Maybe. Identify. Manufacture. Portend. Well, I think we can assume that there are other religions in the region and that there are religious tribal rites that predate Christianity. So traditional means that they were probably converted to Christianity, and so incorporate. A lot of times when a group converts, they will carry over, and indeed when religions emerge, they actually carried over many other rites and rituals. 15. If you mention seeing a bird of paradise on your journey, you should blank whether you're referring to the astonishing island bird or to the beautiful flower that is blank of South Africa. Yeah, bird of paradise is both a bird and a flower. Okay. You must indicate, you have to say whether you saw this one or if you saw the flower that's indigenous, that is grown in and native to South Africa. Number 16. Due to Kandahar's blank location along the trade routes of Central and Southern Asia, it has long been the site of blank between empires, strategic location, and struggles. Given that these struggles involve death and killing, then I think it might also be an unfavorable location for a lot of the people who were killed and involved in those struggles, but strategy, sure, let's take a military cultural approach on that one. 17. In addition to his more blank work as an astrophysicist, Carl Sagan held to blank astronomy through his writing, television series, and connection to the space program. Competent work, maybe scholarly, acceptable. Well, if you know Carl Sagan, again, this requires some knowledge of who he is. He popularized physics and astronomy, moreover, not physics so much, but astronomy. Space. Carl Sagan was a very famous public television figure, and he was also a scholar who was an astrophysicist. So in addition to his more scholarly, like his more technical work, he also went on television and brought astronomy to the masses, made it kind of cool in a way. London's Royal Opera House is frequently referred to as simply as the Covent Garden, but in fact Covent Garden refers to the entire neighborhood in which the opera's house is found, from St. Martin's Lane into Drury Lane, encompassing St. Paul's Church and the Covent Garden Market, where Professor Henry Higgins and Colonel Pickering, emerging from the opera, first buy flowers from Eliza Doolittle and My Fair Lady. That was a very long sentence. The land on which the neighborhood stands was once, in fact, a convent garden, and the fruits and vegetables raised and sold by the monks were, for years, a source of vitamins for Londoners. Since the 1600s, fruits and vegetables, no longer grown right there, have been sold at various sites around Covent Garden. As for the Opera House, it was burned down and been rebuilt. It has burned down and been rebuilt twice since George Frederick Handel presented Messiah there in 1743 and is still in continuous use. Choose one answer. What does the nickname of the Opera House, from what does the nickname of the Opera House originally derive? Where does it come from? The Royal Gardens? No. Vegetable patch belonging to a convent? Yes. The flower market that was made famous by My Fair Lady? No. The vegetable market that has stood nearby? No. The neighborhood surrounding? No, it was the convent. In fact, a convent garden. Convent meaning, to me, a place where nuns live, not necessarily monks. The author apparently assumes the reader has visited, well, I hope not, recognizes My Fair Lady and Messiah, and it certainly seems so in that long first sentence. I know the name My Fair Lady as a play. I don't know Messiah. Is familiar with many types of vegetables? Probably not. It says fruits and vegetables raised and sold there. Good source of vitamins. I think most people know that vegetables are a good source of vitamin. Why would the author assume that we live in part of London outside Drury Lane? And is Messiah an Italian and French opera? I don't know how Italian and French operas are even related here. So, no. And in much of the verbal reasoning, just a quick side note, and the verbal reasoning as compared to the quantitative reasoning, the verbal reasoning requires quite a hefty knowledge base of culture and literature and things, and a lot of words that people almost never use, or shall we say people use maybe to show off a little bit. And even in academic writing, people don't use a lot of these words. Whereas the quantitative portion is elementary. So I'm personally surprised at how skewed, imbalanced the GRE is when it doesn't even really assess calculus or deep statistics or much past the high school level in the quantitative reasoning part. It assesses a lot of really esoteric English literature knowledge and vocabulary that are at least debatably not important for most majors, but nonetheless. Number 20. Which of the following best describes the function of the concluding sentence? The concluding sentence is back to the opera house. when there's a long digression here. We mentioned the opera house in the beginning, and then it goes into the My Fair Lady and the origins of the names of the fruits and things. Does it summarize the fundamental ideas? I'm not sure there is any fundamental idea other than that the opera house was named after the convent garden, and the conclusion sentence does not actually mention that. Was there a premise other than some kind of useless facts, and then something about how it got its nickname? No. Does it qualify the original statement? What was the original statement? Something about My Fair Lady? Circles back, sure. It mentions the opera house again. Yeah. So we start with the name, and then we go off into this kind of tangent about something with My Fair Lady, and then a little bit more about how it got its nickname, and then back to the opera house itself that had been burnt down. All right. Choose more than one answer now. The earliest recorded inhabitants of the tiny island of Senegal were the Jola people, and they remained the blank ethnic group of the island. Again, choose two answers that are synonyms, basically, and they make sense. So the earliest recorded inhabitants of this island were the Jola people, and they remain the dominant and the prevailing, dominant and prevailing. The crowded doesn't make sense. The complex doesn't make sense. Exceptional doesn't make sense. Established kind of makes sense, but not as much as prevailing and dominant. Those are the two best. In medieval England, the general population could rarely read or write, so people received news via the blank of the town crier. Advent, no. It's like the start or the convocation or something, the introduction. Recordings, they didn't have recordings in medieval England. There was no electricity. The announcements, sure. The auspices, no. It's totally off the topic. Rejoinders, no. Rejoinders, again, is kind of like the one distractor that draws them in. But the town crier. Again, if you know what a town crier is, it requires some knowledge of Old English culture. Once again, very heavy bias on the English literature and Old English kind of cultural perspective here. But the crier would go around and yell out some news or shout out some news, proclaim or announce. The Atlantic and Pacific Highway was the most important connection between East and West Coast in the early years of the automobile travel. It was largely blank, but by the development of the U.S. highway system beginning around the mid-1920s. So in the early years, this was the really important one, but then this new highway came around, and if you've seen the Disney cartoon Cars, you'll know that big superhighway basically eradicated and eliminated the small town-to-town highways. Depreciated. I mean, there are some buildings that certainly got depreciated along the highway. It did not revitalize it because we have but. So there's an opposite effect here. Salvaged. It didn't salvage it either. Although living benefactors may provide kidneys and bone marrow to patients who need transplants, far more organ donations blank deceased donors than living ones. They come from and they derive from. Start out in, set off from, embark on. These are all the wrong direction, basically. And then give to, again, is the wrong direction. Pioneers use clematis as a pepper substitute, and some Native Americans use small traces to cure headaches. Nevertheless, the plant is blank toxic. Why would we say nevertheless if it was by no means? Is acutely, that means that even a little bit would kill us. Essentially, that makes sense. In effect, that makes sense. Sporadically and rarely, these two make sense, but then why would we say it? It's sometimes toxic. I don't think nevertheless would be the right transition here. but it is any factor essentially. So that toxic effect might be what cures headaches or what gives the same flavor as pepper. All right, that was the end of section 3.